in the southwest of the United Kingdom, and in Berlin. And the folks in these different cities engage in investigations, is what we call them, with specific constituencies around specific issues in those cities. There is a consistency in the focus of this work. The kind of core issues that we all address, not necessarily with the same intensity, are this issue of fair housing. This is a big issue in Los Angeles. The issue of racial, sexual, and health justice, which is a crucial issue in the New York Collective. The issue of radical education, but also migrant and immigrant rights, which is very important in the European context. There is no formal way in which we monitor what is happening in these sites. In the same way that the growth of the collective is not intentional. Nobody is ever invited to join Ultra-red. In fact, new members announce themselves as being Ultra-red, and part of it is a slow process where we have worked together with somebody for a long period of time in struggle, exuberant struggle, really. Struggle sounds like hard work. There is nothing more life-giving and joyful than being in a meaningful collective engagement around the needs of your community. And that exuberance is extraordinary. And at a certain point, it becomes so clear that there is a deep shared investment that the folks move along and sort of announce themselves as members of the collective. We convene once a month by Skype for 2 hours to address various issues, and a lot of that actually just has to do with reports from the field. And so part of what happens with our collective is that we see ourselves as a kind of research collective, where we're constantly aggregating the procedures and practices that are happening in each of these sites around the issues that we're dealing with. So I'll close by giving you an example of something that arises out of this. We have become very interested in the question of participation and the many forms of participation. And in many sort of senses within the kind of neoliberal project, there has been, in the United Kingdom, for example, this requirement that just about any government decision be made in consultation with the community. If you're going to build a new building, you must convene a consultation with the community. And this appears to be a form of democracy. In fact, what it actually is an incredibly cynical process of social control, of in fact manipulating a kind of consent. Who gets to speak under what conditions? We have come to refer to this as the value form of participation, using the Marxist term of value form. That participation is not honored in and of itself, it is instrumentalized. So we have been, and of course we're seeing this happening with social practice art, where the artist now, in a certain sense, in many instances, through these practices of participation, in fact, becomes the avant-garde for these kinds of processes. In the United Kingdom, it was the outsourcing, for example, of turning the management of community libraries over to artists in order that the state could, in the neoliberal process, retrench itself. And so they would give a little bit of money to artists in order to be able to run the public libraries, so that they could then cut the budgets for the public libraries. Right? So this is this. So we have been writing a series of texts around this, have been convening once a month in order to discuss this and share notes and monitor and manage this. We, in November, will be holding a 3-day conference at the University of California in Santa Cruz, precisely around this issue of the value form of participation within the context of public housing, art, education, and public health. So this is so we have this process of you're deeply invested in the work that you're doing in the location where you are, and then through our convening, we are constantly in dialogue and sharing what it is that we're learning.
We can do one more question for this phase of our conversation, and as most of you probably know, we'll be continuing our conversation across the street at the SMFA for a reception and a viewing of the exhibition, and I think there's food and beverages too waiting us. So, but one final question to close off this part of the conversation.
So I kind of a constellation of notes here. I think that so I made a kind of a constellation of notes, but I think in relation to what I've been hearing here and the reading that I did, which kind of confronted us with the conditions of and the evolution of poverty in Latin America. And I've done some reading recently about some findings about how potentially trauma or kind of post-traumatic stress can be transmitted genetically and not necessarily through like a direct contact with trauma. So I'm interested maybe to hear Carol or Danica or Robert kind of talk about that a little bit in relation to a kind of a potential artistic practice.
Yeah, it's on, okay. So, it's something that I think is difficult to speak about unless you have a relationship with somebody and you walk, like I talk about walking a lot. In Latin America, part of it is the genetics that you're exposed to cortisol like constantly because it's like since the womb. So when you come out, you have, it's also just stimulus everywhere. And also when you're being raised, there's also the stories that you're told. The stories that are just over and over of like what the government of the United States does to you, the mistrust of the people who work in your house, the mistrust of your own family members. And so there's this perpetual struggle within oneself and within each other. And that's kind of where I think that locality is really important, and Robert touched on that. But when you, I think part of it is recognizing those relationships that you have with each other and then just it's kind of beautiful because it's a cycle that repeats itself in Latin America, and that you see your parents go through, and then you see in your streets and everything. But when you start talking to people and sharing that, like, oh, I remember in second grade we were talking about the United Fruit Company, and we were talking about these abandoned towns in the middle of nowhere because of the railway. And we don't just talk about it, then we realize, oh wow, like that's where my grandfather is from, and that's in this story, and oh, that's where I go for the weekends, and so this is where I worked for your grandfather's family, and you start having this connection because of just relationships that happen, and because we wear that pain on our sleeve, we wear it like constantly, and we reappropriate. So there's an example of the dress in Guatemala, for example, the traditional dress, and it was imposed as an alternative to branding the body. So farmers would brand the body of any one of their indentured servants. And so they were coming to see, well, maybe that's not the best way to do it, so let's give them a color. And so each farm had its color. And then through that, the people just started expressing their own history and knowledge of the land and knowledge of each other on their wardrobe, and that became a point of pride. And now it's something that when they have catastrophes and it wipes the whole town away, you can't just donate clothes because they refuse to wear anything but their dress. So it's this reappropriation of something that was painful and that then becomes beautiful. Or so, for example, in my practice, I have a hard time calling it art. I mostly call it relationship making, because this sewage water, this river, is the source of electricity in our country, a lot of it. It's the source of recycled plastic that feeds into our economy. And it's also the place of labor for a lot of different classes that meet together there. And so part of what I do there is go on walks on the shore bank and just talk about what people see and what I see, and we share that. It's really fascinating to be walking with a man in a suit down this river, and you find bags of poop next to these really funny tractors, toy tractors, and you start talking about childhood, and you start talking about these things that aren't compartmentalized the way that I think that we think of them as, oh, struggle. We think of it more as a cohesive unit that's always kind of flowing.
I think with that, we will close. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Danica. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Shida. Thank you, Monica. Thanks to all of you. And I look forward to seeing you across the street if you can join us. And I hope that this process of jumping into each other's rivers and finding new forms of exchange continues for you during your time at the SMFA and throughout your time on this planet. So thank you. Good night.